Hello, everyone. I am so excited for tonight. I'm so happy that you are joining us. This is Left Bank Books presents author and New York Times contributor Annalee Newitz, who will discuss their new book, Four Lost Cities: A Secret History of the Urban Age. Annalee will be in conversation with award-winning author Rebecca Roanhorse. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore, celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Annalee and Rebecca, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted and are still bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books, with curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It allows us to keep this wonderful event series going. And if you purchase a copy of the book this evening, you will get one of these beautiful postcards signed by Annalee. So I thank you for your support. We need your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment at any point through the production. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. I am so excited about some of the events that we have lined up. We are announcing new events daily. So be sure to get signed up, because there are definitely going to be events that you are interested in. About tonight's book. Four Lost Cities is one of Apple's most anticipated books of 2021. A quest to explore some of the most spectacular ancient cities in human history and figure out why people abandoned them. In Four Lost Cities, acclaimed science journalist Annalee Newitz takes readers on an entertaining and mind-bending adventure into the deep history of urban life. Investigating across the centuries and around the world, Newitz explores the rise and fall of four ancient cities, each the center of sophisticated civilization. And I'm going to have trouble saying this, but the Neolithic site of Catalhoyuk in central Turkey, the Roman vacation town of Pompeii on Italy's southern coast, the medieval megacity of Angkor in Cambodia, and the indigenous metropolis Cahokia, which stood beside the Mississippi River where East St. Louis is today, not far from where I am right now. Newitz travels to all four sites and investigates the cutting-edge research in archaeology, revealing the mix of environmental changes and political turmoil that doomed these ancient settlements. Tracing the early developments of urban planning, Newitz also introduces us to often anonymous workers, slaves, women, immigrants, and manual laborers who built these cities and created monuments that lasted millennia. Four Lost Cities is a journey into the forgotten past, but foreseeing a future in which the majority of people on Earth will be living in cities, and may also reveal something of our own fate. N.K. Jemisin, the author of the Broken Earth trilogy and The City We Became, says, Newitz always sees to the heart of complex systems and breaks them down with poetic ferocity. And Sarah Parcock, the archaeologist and author of Archaeology from Space, says, Annalee Newitz is a brilliant writer with the heart of an archaeologist and the soul of a visionary. Four Lost Cities should open our eyes to all that may happen to our cities in the future. Vibrant and adventurous, this is a necessary book for turbulent times. And I will add that I found it fascinating. Tonight's speakers. Annalee Newitz, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, is a founder of IO9 and former editor-in-chief at Gizmodo. They are the author of Scatter, Adapt, and Remember the novels, and the novels Autonomous and The Future of Another Timeline. They live in San Francisco. Rebecca Roanhorse is a New York Times bestselling and Nebula, Hugo, and Locus award-winning speculative fiction writer. She has published multiple award-winning short stories and novels, including 2 in the 6th World Series, Star Wars, Resistance Reborn, Race to the Sun for the Rick Riordan imprint, and her latest novel, Black Sun, which if you haven't read, you absolutely must. She has also written for Marvel Comics and for television. She lives with her husband and daughter in northern New Mexico and can be found at RebeccaRoanhorse.com or on Twitter at RoanhorseX, E-E-X. And now, I am so happy and proud to welcome our guests for the evening, Annalee Newitz and Rebecca Roanhorse for Left Bank Books. If everyone at home would please applaud as I welcome them to the screen. Hello!
Hello.
Hello. Thanks so much for having us, Shane. I just wanted to add that, even if you don't buy my book or Rebecca's books tonight, buy something from Left Bank Books, because when I was out at Cahokia for 2 summers in a row, joining an excavation, one of the things that was really nice was going back to St. Louis in the evenings and getting to go to Left Bank Books. So it kept me sane when my fingers were blistered, and it's just such a beautiful, great bookstore. So buy a bunch of stuff there. So this is the first week that my book has been out, and this week I've been doing events where I've been talking about each of the cities in the book. So tonight we'll be talking about Cahokia. Earlier in the week I talked about Çatalhöyük and Pompeii, and so if you want to learn about those, you have to get the book. But tonight, I'm so psyched to be able to chat with Rebecca, because she and I have had a lot of conversations about Cahokia over the past few years, and coming at it from really different angles. And of course, Rebecca is quoted a lot in my book, so you can find out more about her thoughts on that in the book and today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by... Also, hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
You're sitting there on the screen, and I'm just like, oh, yeah.
I'll probably go away when you start to read.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from the book. Mostly we're going to be talking, but I wanted to kind of introduce you to the city. And one way I'm going to do that is I'm going to do some screen sharing. Very exciting. And show you what Cahokia might have looked like from a map perspective. This is a map from the book of Cahokia. It was made by Jason Thompson, who's an amazing map maker who's done a lot of work for Dungeons and Dragons. So it was great to have him do something that's a real map. So here you can see kind of the bigger layout of Cahokia, and then the central Cahokia, which is what you'd see if you visited the Cahokia Mound State Park in southern Illinois. And this is sort of a recreation of what the downtown might have looked like. And at the center of it, there's this enormous mound. It's basically an earthen pyramid with a flattened top that had ceremonial structures on top. There's another level, it's kind of terraced. And today you can go visit. It doesn't look like this anymore. It's much more rounded and covered in grass. But this is enormous. I mean, when Europeans finally stumbled across the city, centuries after it had been abandoned, they could still tell that it had been fashioned by human hands. The footprint is about the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza. So it's quite significant. And of course, the entire city is built around smaller earthen mounds, different shaped mounds all over the place. So coming into the area, you couldn't help but know that humans had completely refashioned the landscape. Okay, so I'm going to read to you just a little bit while you're looking at the map. By the reckoning of the Roman calendar, people started erecting Cahokia's first monuments in the late 900s. At the time, European civilization was mired in the superstitions and brutal monarchies of the Middle Ages. But in North America, there was no entrenched medieval aristocracy, nor ancient Latin texts hinting at a lost great civilization. Instead, there were powerful but ever-changing social movements that temporarily united tribes and nations, and whose closest modern analogs might be political revolutions or religious revivals. And these unfolded against a backdrop of living urban history in the Americas, embodied in massive earthworks and stone monuments whose origins went back thousands of years. Based on what we know from indigenous oral histories and observations by Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's likely that Cahokia was founded by leaders, or maybe one charismatic leader, who promised a spiritual and cultural rebirth. Some call Cahokia a city built on religion, but its origins were much more complicated than that. Perhaps the best way to put it would be to say that the city was spawned by a social movement that swept across the U.S. South and the Midwest, all along the shores of the Mississippi River. The Cahokians left no writing behind that we can recognize, so we can't say for sure what this movement was. But it was inspired by the founders' knowledge of North American history. Mound cities, like Cahokia, are an ancient tradition in this part of the continent, going back millennia before the founding of Cahokia. North America's first known earthworks are in Louisiana. The oldest, called Watson Break, dates back 5,500 years, centuries before the first Egyptian pyramids were built. Another is at Poverty Point, built 3,400 years ago near the Mississippi in northern Louisiana. Today, you can still see Poverty Point's crescent-shaped mounds towering like huge nested parentheses on a bluff overlooking a now dry riverbed. 1,000 years after Poverty Point was abandoned, people from the Hopewell culture built even more astounding mound cities in Ohio and throughout the Northeast. The Cahokians would have known about these mounds from ancestral histories and could have seen them along the Mississippi, but they might also have been influenced by contemporary pyramids in the Mayan and Toltec metropolises further south. As the city grew, so too did its farms, and the cultivated fields spread outward from Cahokia into the Illinois uplands. We find traces of Mississippian culture all along the river, where towns and small cities built mounds and shared some of the rituals of Cahokia. The city footprint was enormous, and archaeologists sometimes say that the metropolis had precincts, and you can see that in the map. The precincts are basically the densely populated center around Monk's Mound, as well as another center identified in East St. Louis, and yet another where the city of St. Louis stands today. It's likely that these weren't separate cities. They were more like downtown neighborhoods separated by farms. And I should add, if you're a St. Louis person and you want to know how this fits into your city, there was an enormous mound in St. Louis, rivaling Monk's Mound here in central Cahokia that you can see on the map. But in the 19th century, it was torn down to use as landfill under the railroad. So all of the precious artifacts from that mound, all of the culture and history are gone. And there are accounts from people who were excavating there, tearing it apart for the railroad, saying like, wow, there's all this crazy shit in here. What is this? I don't know. It's beads and what is that? And it just makes you want to get in a time machine and go back and shake them by their suspenders. All right, just a little bit more. Whatever Cahokia's leaders did, they were incredibly successful at attracting a broad audience. Over a third of Cahokia's population were immigrants who had been born and raised far from the city. We know this because scientists use a process called stable isotope analysis that reveals where a person grew up. By studying the chemical composition of tooth enamel from human remains at Cahokia, scientists can discern the specific isotopic signatures left behind by the food and water that people ingested as children. If a person was buried at Cahokia, but grew up consuming food and water from a distant location, then that person was almost certainly an immigrant. And then I want to talk about, just to finish up, I'm going to read a little bit about the abandonment of Cahokia, because this is one of the most intriguing and mysterious parts of the city. Why did people leave? So Cahokian celebrations, the city was a very big party city, so Cahokian celebrations didn't happen exclusively in the downtown area. They mostly took place in small plazas and public buildings in neighborhoods far from downtown. Not everyone could fit into the Grand Plaza downtown, but these local celebrations weren't mere overflow seats. Instead, they reflected Cahokia's diverse cultural makeup. This was a city of immigrants who didn't all share one language or set of traditions. Especially during feast times, when a lot of tourists came to town from all along the Mississippi River, there would have been family reunions and gatherings of people who came from similar backgrounds. They would have participated in variations on the big downtown celebrations, perhaps involving local leaders who could conduct ceremonies in the languages preferred by people in that neighborhood. One such ceremony is known colloquially among archaeologists as closing up. Throughout the city, researchers have found evidence that Cahokians had special rituals for ending the life of a house or a building. First, they would pull up the wooden poles that formed its walls, recycling them for use as firewood. Then they would carefully fill the post holes with colorful clay, sometimes flecked with shimmering mica or mixed with pottery and tools that may have come from the home's past history. The floor would be washed with water or covered in soil. Sometimes a house would be burned. It's not uncommon to find that people dug a pit in the floor of an abandoned house and then filled it with the smoking remains of domestic items, pottery, corn cobs, woven mats, jewelry, broken stone knives. All of these rituals seemed to seal up the house and made the space ready for a new home. Cahokians loved to build their homes right on top of the ritualistically closed-up floors of previous ones. They drove new wall posts right into the filled post holes of the last house. When archaeologists excavate a home, they frequently find several floors carefully packed atop each other, each one representing roughly a generation of residents. It's as if people were giving their houses funeral rites. You might say Cahokians believed their city was alive, but they also accepted that its lifespan was finite. And I just think that that's very interesting to think about in the context of city life, because in the West, I think we believe, or there's a Western notion that cities should last forever. And at Cahokia, we see rituals that that indicate that people didn't necessarily think that. I'm just going to show you a few pictures from Cahokia, and then Rebecca and I are going to chat. So this is a picture of Monk's Mound today. This is not how it would have looked historically, but the stairs are apparently in roughly the correct position. This is one of my favorite figurines from Cahokian culture. It's a woman who's farming, and women farmed a lot in this culture. And she's holding a hoe, but she's driving it into the back of a serpent. So she's holding the serpent's head down, and the serpent represents the underworld, which is the space where the fecundity comes from for the farms. And so she's just looking super badass. This is another figurine from a Cahokian area. It's a chunky player. Cahokians loved sports, hugely loved them. That's why there was this grand plaza right next to Monk's Mound. We think that may have been for playing chunky. Chunky was played with these round stones. So on the right, you can see the chunky stone. And on the left, you can see this guy looking also pretty badass. He's about to roll the stone out, and then someone else will throw a spear and try to have their spear hit exactly where the stone is going to hit or is going to land. So this is the archaeological dig that I joined. I was very lucky. Two archaeologists, Melissa Baltus and Sarah Barris, let me come out and watch them and get dirty with them. And they're here digging kind of near Monk's Mound. They're in a domestic area. It's not a ritual space. And it's a place called Spring Lake Tract. And there they are. That's Melissa and Sarah doing their archaeology thing, making lots of maps. And here they are in the floor of a building. And what they're doing is all of those little circles are places where there were post holes. And so they're looking at the fill inside the post hole, like I told you about in the section that I read. So they're identifying them, and then they'll kind of excavate and see what they can find in those post holes after the closing up ritual. And here they are again. This is what archaeology is like. It's basically just like lying in mud. And you can see that Sarah's happy about that. So, all right, let me stop sharing this and be back in human space. All right. Hello.
Hi, that was wonderful. Thank you for reading, and I love the pictures. So exciting. So I want to ask you a question to sort of get us started.
Yeah.
What got you interested in sort of these ancient cities and Cahokia in particular? Because it really feels like, America doesn't really appreciate its ancient history the way that like other cultures might, or other cultures do. And it's always been sort of disturbing, to me, as someone of the indigenous descent, that we don't get to sort of have, the celebration of our indigenous cultures. We don't have like, the way that Egypt keeps, their cultures or Greek does theirs. So Americans don't. So how did you end up enjoying or finding out, and I'm going to say sort of falling for Cahokia?
I did fall for Cahokia. I'm trying to remember when I first read about Cahokia. It was a long time ago. I definitely read Tim Pocketat's book, Cahokia. He's one of the main archaeologists who's done a lot of the modern work there. And now I think he's the Illinois state archaeologist. He's some super fancy guy now who's like in charge of all of Illinois. His book is very accessible. And so I got interested in it. And I had the same reaction that you did when I learned about it, which is, why do we not know about this? Why is this not part of our deep history? Because the more you learn, the more you discover that it's not just Cahokia. Like I said, it's goes back 5,000 years, these massive earthworks, these incredible civilizations. And in South America, even older still, it's older than 10,000 years that we find remains of very complicated settlements. So part of me wants to, part of this is just an intervention to get people thinking about it, especially white settlers who are the ones that created this massive historical disjuncture that we have. Because that's part of what I think we're fighting against when we talk about these indigenous civilizations that predate any kind of white settler culture, right? Because these are not groups that Europeans would have encountered when they came. These were the ancestors of the groups that they encountered. And there's this huge disruption where all of this history that everyone who lived here knew about gets erased deliberately, in most cases by white settlers doing everything from residential schools to just straight up murder. And now I feel like we're lucky that we're kind of at a moment where a lot of indigenous thinkers and writers like yourself are actually writing about this stuff. And it's getting acknowledged publicly. I mean, people have always been talking about it, but there's a difference between people talking about it in a kind of marginalized space and then actually mainstream culture saying, oh yeah, this is a thing. So there's that, which is the political part. But then the one other little thing I'll add is that there's also just something really fascinating about how different the urbanism at Cahokia is from white settler urbanism that we have here and in Europe. For the reason that I said about how it feels like this was a city that was not built to last, and nobody thought that was a big deal. It was like, oh yeah, we'll build something amazing. It's going to last in the sense that these earthworks will last, but the city itself, part of a city is that it goes away. And I love that idea. It just feels, it's just a very alien way of thinking about it. And it feels actually, to be honest, a little bit healthier than our weird attachment to like maintaining our cities over time, despite problems.
And I'm going to come back to that because one of the things I thought was very interesting in the book was when you reflected on your time in San Francisco, when you first moved there and how it was a city in transition. But I did one of the things in your book that really struck me that I don't think, one of the things I try to do in my fiction too, when I'm being inspired by these cities, is sort of reflect how diverse they actually were. Because I think people start to think of Indigenous Americas as sort of this one, sort of homogenous group, and everybody looked the same and everybody did the same things. And even now, there's 500, different nations, under just, federally recognized Native nations. So when you talked about Cahokia and the immigration, how it was a city of immigrants, how people came from all over the Americas or the American bottom to this city. So talk a little bit about that, because I don't think most people realize that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most exciting parts of what's happening in American archaeology right now, but also archaeology more generally. I think that a lot of these big civilizations, like the Mississippian civilization, which when we say that, we are talking about Cahokia, but we're also talking about all of these other communities all along the Mississippi, this massive, massive number of people who are definitely participating in some of the same rituals, but also, as I said in the excerpt that I read, they're speaking different languages. They're coming from different histories. They have a very different relationship with whatever Mississippian culture is. And I think now, partly because we have more data, and partly because, archaeologists have gotten wiser, I suppose, over time, we're starting to see people writing about diversity in ancient cities much more, and focusing on that, like looking for it. Whereas I think historically, like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, one of the things that archaeologists would look for was continuities, and because they were trying to find like the edges of a culture, and they'd say like, okay, Cahokia is at the center. Where are the edges of that kind of Mississippian culture? How can we draw a big blob on the map? And now archaeologists will go to different Mississippian sites. And I mean, I see papers, I get alerts from academia.edu all the time on new Mississippian related papers. And almost every day there's a new paper that says, here's a specific site that we found, somewhere in Louisiana. And, it's totally got its own set of artistic traditions, and it's incorporating Mississippian tradition. And even at the site of Cahokia, we know that people came from far away because they would do things like design projectile points using Cahokian style, and also using styles that were from more southern regions. And so that's my favorite thing. Like whenever an archaeologist says like, I have an object that's a hybrid of two different cultural traditions, I'm like, yes, that is the object I want to hear about. How did that happen? And I wanted to throw that question back at you, because I feel like in your trilogy that starts with Black Sun, and that's going to have a sequel soon, you're trying to recreate the world that Cahokia is in. And so how did you think about making it clear to the reader that this just wasn't one monolithic blob of like indigenous culture?
Yeah. So for those that don't know, I'm we said that, right? I was speculative fiction writer. So I have the trilogy. The first book is Black Sun. And, I was not, historically accurate. I mixed up a lot of different eras. So nobody, hold me to anything. It's definitely a fantasy book. But I really was trying to celebrate a lot of the ancient indigenous cultures of the Americas, and then give them sort of a fantasy bent. But it was important for me, there's so many distinct, languages and ways of dress and jewelry and just everything. It was actually really easy to make those distinctions if you do a little bit of research, even between the Maya and the Aztec and the ancestral Puebloans and Cahokia. And, those were sort of my main influences. And I tried to create, there is some overlap, like the concept of Cahokia as a religious city really influenced my ideas around the religious city in the book, Tova. But I also pulled from Chaco Canyon, who had some very similar ideas about a religious center, with roads that sort of went nowhere. They went religious places. They didn't go like, to commercial places. and to just sort of portray that as a sort of metropolitan mix of different kinds of people and cultures, and that you don't normally get to see when you're talking about the indigenous Americas.
I
Yeah.
love I love the city of Tova in Black Sun. I felt like it felt like Chaco Canyon, but plus like a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was like I could imagine Chaco Canyon, but then there's all these bridges that people are passing over, and like maybe that happened at Chaco. I don't know. I mean, there could have been bridges like that. I mean, we don't know.
Right.
No
Right.
one's telling us. So yeah, I think this is one of the things that you and I talked about a lot, actually, when I was talking to you for this book, was the question about religious cities versus commercial cities. Because again, I think the Western idea of a city is that if it has a central plaza, that's a marketplace. And so when Western archaeologists first encountered Cahokia, that's totally what they assumed. And there just doesn't seem to be evidence for that. Like, people traded stuff, but it wasn't like people came and were like, I have 50 bales of corn or whatever. I guess corn doesn't come in bales, but whatever. I have like a bunch of vessels full of stuff to sell, and, and you're going to give me something in return. Like, it doesn't seem like that kind of activity was going on. But then I talked to you and you were like, well, but we have to think about the fact that there would have been something like a commercial enterprise happening. Like, it's not devoid of that. It's not like these are cities where people just hung out and prayed all the time. Like, that's not how cities work,
Yeah, and I was very interested in, even just now when you were talking and saying, hey, maybe the mounds could have been influenced by what they saw, around them in Mississippi, in the Mississippi region, but they might have also been influenced by what they saw or what they'd heard of, from what is now Mexico, from the Toltecs or the Maya, and that just, to me, implies trade. It implies that these people were, moving. Again, there were, probably ships that crossed the Gulf of Mexico. You could also, get there by land, but that's a long way around. But, and so I find that stuff fascinating, that you could find, turquoise, or shells from California, now in South America, and vice versa, which suggested travel and trade and some sort of sophistication to the cultures that are often, not recognized, or sort of just sort of relegated to this hunter-gatherer idea, which is clearly they're not, right?
And it's completely inaccurate to all of the evidence that we have. Of course, there were hunter-gatherers. There were hunter-gatherers in Europe and Asia. They were all over, but there were also these massive, massive urban civilizations. And in the case of the Mississippian civilization, one of the things that we see are those chunky stones. All up and down the Mississippi. And we know people they weren't trading them like for money. Like, I don't think it was a thing where there was some person who was like, I'm the chunky stone king, and like, everybody buy my chunky stones or whatever. It was much more like these were mementos, or these were treasured stones, like lucky stones or whatever, that people played with. But we know that many of them originate at Cahokia, and people would take them home all the way to Florida in some cases, so they would come, they'd party downtown Cahokia. They ate barbecue. We know that in Cahokia, people just frickin' loved barbecue. And just like now, actually. And then they'd play a little chunky and take home a souvenir. But there had to have been informal trading going on. And like, just, even if it was cultural trading, right? Like, even if it wasn't like, I brought you a bunch of stuff from the colonies, it's like, still, I bring you knowledge from another place. So yeah.
You brought up parties. So let's talk a little bit about food, because one of the conversations we had, I remember, was about what people would be eating. And, of course, everyone's, eating corn in one way or another. But I remember we were having this conversation, and you were like, no. Let's talk about what the Cahokians were eating. And it's not what you think it was. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly toward the end of the occupation of the city by its original inhabitants, people were eating corn. But corn came up from the south, and it really didn't reach North America until a lot later than it reached, South America and Mexico. And so there are a number of crops that folks at Cahokia cultivated that have now gone wild again. Things like marsh elder, something called erect knotweed, which I just love the name of it, but also we know this because there are archaeologists who specialize in looking at these ancient crops. They're called lost crops. And they find, caches of them where people had obviously picked a bunch of erect knotweed seeds. They were kind of big seeds that maybe you could pop like popcorn, or you could break them down into a kind of mush. But they would, bury them to eat later and then leave and never use them. And so sometimes in a Mississippian settlement, you'll be able to just find like a bucket of these, not an actual bucket, but there's a great book. I want to just advertise it for people. This is by Gail Fritz. And it just came out a couple of years, I guess last year. And she has spent her whole career studying, it's called Feeding Cahokia. And she's studied these lost crops. It's such a great book. It's got tons of amazing detail and research from her, many encounters with these crops, and also looking at them in the context of people's lives. And so we have to imagine that people had a very diverse diet, and they were eating things that we just don't eat now, and that we could bring back. We could start eating marsh elder again. And I would love to have like a knotweed stew. Fantasize about it quite a bit.
Yes. And I made sure to put marsh elder and knotweed into Black Sun. I don't know if you noticed
I
that.
saw that and I was like, yeah.
That's awesome.
No, it's super interesting to think about the fact that there was basically an entire cuisine that is now gone. And it's the same thing in California here. There were the Ohlone here in the San Francisco Bay Area ate tons of acorn bread and Bannock flatbread. And the Spanish, when they came, one of the things that they said about the folks they encountered in California was that their food was delicious and it was so good, and they just wanted more and more. And I was like, I wish we still had that. I mean, we still do. People still do make acorn bread, but it's not as popular as it should be. So
right. And there is a movement in indigenous cultures to sort of bring back traditional foods, particularly like for health reasons, because a lot of indigenous communities suffer from diabetes and things like that. So that's sort of exciting to see. I know there's some great chefs working in traditional foods. So you never know. You might get your knotweed stew.
I'm there for it.
So one other thing I wanted to mention, us talk about a little bit, was this concept of collapse. So I was flipping channels the other night, and I came across Mel Gibson's Apocalypto. For those of you
Mel Gibson's documentary.
Yes. That is his take on the collapse of Maya civilization, because it was so corrupt and so awful that it had to fall. But I think saner minds have a little different take on why some of these great civilizations, or why these cities were abandoned. So in one of my favorite, one of my favorite sections of your book, you mentioned someone who wrote a paper called F. Jared Diamond. And so maybe talk a little bit about this concept of collapse, and how it's actually sort of a incorrect idea, or at least a challenged idea, and where the field is going.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oops, I'm just going to yank my headphones off now. It is true that I think, a previous generation of archaeologists really bought into this idea that civilizations collapse, and that cities, when they are abandoned, kind of represent a failed civilization. And that's not how archaeologists talk about it now. By and large, people talk about civilizations transforming, because that fits the evidence a lot more. It just fits the evidence a lot better, because what we see is enormous continuity. When Cahokia is abandoned, it's not like the people there disappear and take all of their culture with them. These are groups that went on to join, we think, Siouan tribes, and there was a tremendous cultural continuity there. There's still some of the same, people still play chunky. People still have some of the same heroes and icons that we think they had at Cahokia. And so it's not, I think that there's this urge to say that things collapse because it's a simple story, because we are able to just say, okay, well, that group is dead and gone. We don't have to worry about them anymore. But what we know just from looking at the history of Cahokia is that there was this deep history for them of their own civilization. They were looking back at previous civilizations, just as we look back now. And the other thing that's very interesting about Cahokia, and this is something I learned from Melissa Baltus, the archaeologist I was working with down there, is that Cahokia went through a lot of changes. It went through a lot of transformations. And I talk about this a lot in the book about how we can see that the urban plan of the city changed. It was on a very strict grid, and then slowly it became much more oriented around kind of a courtyard neighborhood pattern where houses would be built in a circle around a central courtyard instead of on a grid kind of surrounding one of these central precincts like Monk's Mound or the big mound over in St. Louis. And so clearly people were changing their relationship to each other. They were changing their relationship to the environment. Probably they had different social systems that fit in better to those different kinds of urban designs. So again, the city is always transforming. The people and the culture there are transforming. And so when a city is abandoned, it's just another example of cultural transformation. This is a civilization that moves on from that city, and they move into other ways of living, either going toward smaller tribal groups, villages, other cities. There were other cities. They could have all hightailed it down south and hung out in some of those cities down there. And, that would have been cool too. And so we know that, accounts, these sort of facile accounts that you get from people like Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, really just, they don't fit the facts. And so I think that that's become something that we kind of, it's a bit of a myth. Before we go to audience questions, though, I wanted to ask you one final thing, and then we'll talk to the audience. But your work deals a lot with sort of this deep history of Indigenous culture, but you're also part of the Indigenous futurist movement. I'm just going to tell you what movement you're part of, but you're dealing with these questions of the future of Indigenous culture and Indigenous tribal groups. And so I wonder how you see a knowledge of this deep history fitting into looking into the future.
Yeah, so I guess for me, and I think for a lot of Indigenous futurists, part of our work is sort of reframing or reclaiming history, I think, because of these persistent myths of savageness or simplicity or whatever that is that's sort of feeding that narrative. And I wrote this epic fantasy novel, which epic fantasy usually is based in some sort of like historical, pseudo historical setting, as sort of a way to reclaim Indigenous America, the history of the Indigenous Americas. Just like I said before, to celebrate it, to understand that you really can't have a future without a past, but our understanding of the past is just a narrative. And it's not necessarily a correct one. So you can look at things like, Columbus, 1492, they came and discovered the New World, or you can reframe that as like a conquest, and the millions of people that were here, there were already millions of people here. He didn't discover anything. And so it makes a difference. Just like you said, there's so much of American history that we don't learn, or pre-American history, I should say. And it serves an agenda. It's for a purpose. There's a reason we aren't taught it. And I think part of the work of Indigenous futurists is to reclaim that and to reframe the historical narrative and to say that, we were sophisticated cultures. We had our own languages, our own foods, our own crops that, and all of those sorts of things that we've talked about in Cahokia, and that we can all sort of celebrate that and recognize that. And it makes a difference when you think about what our future will look like when you understand what our past looked like.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, in the next 100 years, I think we're going to see an amazing change in how we are understanding that history and how Indigenous sovereignty can change democracy. Like, we have so many great models of democracy coming out of tribes and nations that are not the United States, but that are still physically here within these lands. And so I really am excited about that. All right, so let's take some questions. Hi, Shane.
I'm back.
Yay.
Thank you so much for the incredible discussion. If viewers at home have not gotten a chance to read the book, because it is very, very new, I can just say that from reading the book and listening to your discussion, I am even more fascinated and just enthralled by the subject. I want to start with a silly question from me. So no one else gets any blame for this. But I remember the first time, I was an adult when I went to Cahokia for the first time. I did not grow up in St. Louis, so it was not right in literally our backyard. So I remember going to Cahokia for the first time and being so just like captivated, and I loved the museum. I loved walking around the grounds, and I found myself afterwards looking around and looking at hills around the area and just saying, like, is that also, like, could that be a Cahokian mound? Like, what are the possibilities? And I'm wondering if that fascination kind of bleeds into your everyday life as well, with this city or other cities as well.
I mean, absolutely. And, some of those mounds that you saw probably were Mississippian or from older cultures. I mean, one of the things that happens if you drive around in the South is you'll see a lot of cities named things like Mounds and Moundsville and stuff. Those are all places where people found cities that were mound cities, like from the Mississippian culture. And they just named their city after that because they knew that people had made that. It wasn't like they thought it was some accident. And in fact, the Cahokia State Park until the 1980s was under a suburb, and right next to Monk's Mound, that beautiful mound that you saw in the picture, they had built a drive-in called Mound's Drive-In. So I always say that that's like the perfect white settler way of celebrating Indigenous culture. It's like, well, we don't actually know, we're not going to let people know about this mound, but we did build you a drive-in with the name Mound on it. So that's how it had been going for a while. And I definitely now look at cities with an archaeologist's eye. I often think about, how is this going to look in 1,000 years, especially garbage? Because archaeologists, I mean, I'm not going to say they love garbage, but like they spend a lot of time in garbage. And I certainly dug up some garbage at Cahokia. And so when I throw things away, I'm like, somebody at some point is really going to be wondering what was going on with our lives.
All right, so a more professional question from Alfredo. Central Cahokia seems to be very similar to the central part of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica capital, which is what is now downtown Mexico City. Do you know if there was communication, trade between Cahokia and Mesoamerica? Let's remember that I cannot pronounce that word.
We know what you're talking about.
Thank you. Is older than Tenochtitlan and also has huge pyramids, but it was abandoned too long before the Mexican capital was built. Some say it was climate change, some say it was war. It's still not very clear. And Alfredo is saying, greetings from Mexico City and a fan of yours. P.S. Why a book about lost cities? And then kind of the question continues about asking, saying that with COVID and with the kind of reconfiguration of cities currently happening due to necessity, wondering if there will be a post-COVID redesign of what we understand for urban space. So a lot of questions to answer, or whatever you want to, if either of you have any comments for that.
Well, I do think that it seems like there may have been some people traveling back and forth between those civilizations. I think almost every archaeologist I've talked to says that that's certainly possible and seems likely. We don't know for sure. Like there were no, again, because this there wasn't a big trade relationship in the ancient world, at least. We don't know how extensive it was, but yeah. And I think Rebecca's right to imagine that in her novel, that would have been something where people could have taken a boat and gone from one city to the next, much the way her characters do, actually, on a pilgrimage. So they're not necessarily going again to like, hey man, I got my chunky stone. You want to trade it for like some marsh elder? So like, I don't know, this is my imaginary huckster from Cahokia. So I think that that's very realistic to imagine that in the same way that, we hear about stuff that's really far away. And not just because we have airplanes, but because people travel. And I don't know, like, actually, Rebecca, do you think that we're going to change our cities after COVID?
I don't know. I think that's a very provocative question. I think it's fascinating. And, I had mentioned earlier, I thought your sort of musing on San Francisco as a living city and how sort of the tech industry boom and bust and boom again changed the nature of the city itself, like even, the layout of the neighborhoods and things like that. I think I'm a big fan of this concept of like living cities and how they have to morph and live or die according to how they service the needs of their residents. So perhaps, I don't know. I live in a very small city. It's not even a city, it's like a town. So I'm not sure. It would be interesting to see. Do you have thoughts?
I mean, I think we have to wait and see. I am kind of right now of the mind that we may not see a large scale transformation in cities because of this pandemic, because it's going to be relatively short lived. I know it feels like it's taking forever because we're all in it and we're watching people get sick and it's really horrifying. But it's not long. I don't know. I mean, it's at most we're going to be really paralyzed for about a year and a half. And the kinds of transformations we see happening at Cahokia, they're on the scale of decades or even a centuries. I don't know. I'll be curious to see. I mean, I think if you want to look at how cities will be redesigned, you have to think about climate change. And I think that's what's going to change our cities profoundly. I mean, where I live in California, pretty much now the normal situation is that 2 months out of the year, you can't breathe because of the wildfires. And that's going to change cities for sure. If people can't breathe 2 months out of the year, or in the South, if they can't go outside because their cities are flooding all the time in Texas or whatever, that's going to change our cities for sure.
Abby's asking, were there other ancient cities you would have liked to have included in the book?
Yes.
20 lost cities.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about a lot of cities as I was putting the book together. Definitely, I thought about including some South American or Central American cities. I love the idea of doing Cahokia, though, because of the fact that it's easy to get to, and it's to people who live in the United States, it's surprising to realize that there's this incredible ancient city in the middle of what they think of as modern cities, like St. Louis. I am really fascinated by a not lost city, Xi'an in Western China, which has had many lifetimes and has been many different cities over the years. And I want to go there. I want to explore it. I think it's a great example of how cities transform through immigration. It was a city that was a great Uyghur city, and was later reclaimed by the Han. And so it's a super cool place. It had but it isn't lost. I mean, none of these cities were lost anyway. I mean, all these cities, everybody knew where they were. It was just that the oftentimes white settlers would kind of stumble on them and be like, whoa, I discovered something. I'll put a drive in here. So yeah, it's very rare that a city is truly lost. And when someone tells you that they found a lost city, always check their facts. Find out, oh, did you find that lost city because a local guy led you there? I wonder if that city was really lost then.
Lindsay's question, and this might be something that either of you can answer if there is an answer. Lindsay's saying, I live close to Sugarloaf Mound on the St. Louis side of the river. I believe it was returned to Osage Nation, ancestors of the mound builders. Do you know if there's been talk about returning the Cahokia area to tribal stewardship and what that might look like?
Oh, wow. That would be cool. Do you know anything about it?
I don't.
I don't think so anytime soon. I mean, it's a state park, so it is state land now. And one of the funny things about Cahokia is that I don't believe at this point that any tribe or nation has laid claim to it. There are nations that are kind of shepherding it and that, come to the area and counted as part of their ancestry in a general sense. But it doesn't have, there's no group that's like, this is definitely our ancestors. It's more people saying like, well, this is part of a larger ancestry, regional kind of power that led to lots of different groups, modern groups. So I guess I would just say that would be amazing. I would love to see something like that happen. And there's certainly a movement now, the land back movement, which is gaining so much traction, especially in Canada. I'd love to see more of that. I think it's just a really powerful idea, and it's high time that we had serious reconciliation and serious reparations for what's happened, that disruption in history that we talked about, which is a very nice way of saying mass murder and genocide.
Let's do one more question. So since you have spent a lot of time at Cahokia, Kathy's asking, I live near Cahokia and have been to the site a few times. Do you have a favorite walking route or site that I should visit? And my question is, how much of the site is actually open to the public? Because I know there's kind of like things that you can go visit and things that you can't go visit.
That's a good question. I mean, I haven't been to the park in a couple of years now, partly because, this past year was garbage. And when you go to the museum there, which is a fantastic museum, I really highly recommend it. They have some routes that they'll show you that you can follow. It's beautiful. There's lovely hikes. You can see a bunch of different mounds. I think what's nice to do is to take a walk to see how big it is, because that's part of what's incredible about it, is that it's not just this big mound. It's like all of these other mounds. There's just, dozens and dozens of them, all different shapes and had different meanings. So I think that's the best thing to do is, visit Monk's Mound. Sure, that's great. And also pay attention to when you see areas that are flooded on the land. There's actually one near the museum. Those are borrow pits that are still there. And borrow pits, that's just a term that archaeologists use for the areas where people dug up the earth to make the mounds and to make Monk's Mound. And they're all over the site, and they're not usually labeled, but they'll be just sort of a depression in the ground, often near a big mound. And that's, to me, amazing, because this was a city that was built to be below ground and above ground. Like, people kept those borrow pits open. It wasn't like they were like, let's dig a hole and then, that's just for getting dirt. It's that hole stayed there. And there's lots of evidence that those holes were parts of ceremonial structures, and they would put special colored clay on the bottom of the borrow pits. And so this was a city that honored the underworld and the upper world as well as our world. So that's just something cool to keep in mind, that like almost everything you're seeing is built by an amazing, sophisticated civilization. There's almost nothing in that park that hasn't been really altered by human hands. So, yeah. It's
Right.
amazing.
Well, I want to thank both of you. This has been an incredible conversation. A reminder that For Lost Cities is available for sale at left-bank.com. You can get a signed postcard with it, with Annalee's. It's kind of hard to see with your incredible
my
signature.
bad signature.
We love it. We love it at the store. Rebecca's book is available for sale at left-bank.com as well. I've included links in the comments for both of those. For
Rebecca's
the audience,
book is called Black Sun, and she also has a book called Trail of Lightning, which is about the future of the Indigenous world. So highly recommend that too.
For the audience, I will tell you that we do have an incredible event this Saturday afternoon for the sci-fi fantasy crowd, which I think there are probably a few in the audience. Everina Maxwell is a debut author. This is getting a ton of incredible reviews. And Lucky, who's a St. Louis author, has a beautiful, delightful, a pleasure to read. So be sure to check in on Saturday for that. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank both of you. This has been such an incredible just evening of digging into our past. I wish literally. Like, I wish I were actually like there digging. So thank you for this incredible conversation, and hope you are well, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having us. Thanks for coming, Rebecca.
Yeah,
and,
thanks for inviting me.
And tomorrow night, I'll be talking about Angkor. So if you want to collect all the cities, you can check my website. It's AnnaleeNewitz.com, and the events section lists where that's going to be. So thanks very much.
Thank you.